So I don't know about all of you in here, but when I was growing up in South Dakota, I loved science. I took all of the science classes that I could, especially when I got to high school. All the chemistry, all the biology, all the physics, anatomy, every single one. And as soon as I got to college, again, I started taking all the science classes I could, especially my first year. And then by the end of the second year, I was a physics major. So kind of specialized a little bit, but just still taking all the science classes I could. And I really enjoyed them. I was really getting a lot out of them. Felt like I was really sort of expanding my mind and really getting into this career. I thought I was going to be a scientist. Until about halfway or so through my third year of college in Minnesota, something kind of swerved for me. And a couple of different things actually happened. One, we started doing more sophisticated, more intricate labs. And I noticed that things like this were happening to me. I would drop things and they would often break. So I was a little clumsy in my labs, kind of breaking things. Usually not as dramatic as this, but things, I just couldn't build the equipment in the exact right way. And I just wasn't as good, as facile with the equipment as other people. And so it was kind of frustrating for me. But even more than that, I realized that I just wasn't enjoying the labs as much as other people around me were. I noticed when their equipment would break, they would be a lot less frustrated about it. They would actually kind of enjoy the troubleshooting process, the kind of tinkering that you have to do with a lot of the equipment. And I just wasn't enjoying that at all. In fact, I found it extremely frustrating. And really, for the first time in my life, I started to think, well, what if I don't actually want to be a scientist? Maybe, it wasn't that I wasn't cut out to be a scientist, but I thought, maybe I don't actually want to be a scientist. And it was a bit of a scary moment for me because I hadn't thought about being anything else in my life from the time I was probably 13 or 14 years old. I was on that track the entire way, got to college, suddenly realized that maybe I don't want to do this anymore. And since then, I found out that that's actually very common. A lot of people go to college, they think they want to do one thing, they get into it a little bit and realize, well, maybe I don't actually want to do this anymore. But I didn't know that. I didn't know it was fairly common, that it happens to a lot of people. And so I kind of panicked. I felt almost kind of empty inside because if I wasn't going to be a scientist, who was I going to be? What was I going to do with myself? So what I decided to do in the short term was run all the way to the other side of the campus and decided to get an English major on top of my physics major. So I was kind of working on parallel tracks there with the science on the one hand and the literature, the English lit on the other hand. And I did enjoy my English lit classes a lot. I liked all the poems and the plays and the novels we were reading, the essays and things. I liked writing papers. I liked the analysis of literature, stuff like that. But eventually, I realized that I kind of missed the science. And I still wanted to be involved in the science, even if I wasn't going to be in a lab myself. And eventually, I realized, took probably longer than it should have, but I realized I could write about science. There were people out there who wrote about science. So I started writing for my campus newspaper, started doing some internships and things like that, started working as a science writer. And eventually realized that actually what I wanted to do more than anything was to write books about science. I had a little bit more room in the books to go into a little bit more depth. I could talk about the history of things. I could be a little bit more, have a little bit more fun, be a little more loose with the language, things like that. And books turned out to be a really, really good fit for me. And so I thought with the talk tonight, I would talk a little bit about each one of my books, tell some different stories from each one. And what I really enjoyed about this is that kind of some different types of stories emerged from each one. Each book has a different focus, a different science, and different types of stories really did emerge from each one. So I wanted to talk a little bit about each one and sort of show the different types of stories, different types of writing I was able to do. So my first book came out in 2010. It's called The Disappearing Spoon. And the premise of this book was to find kind of a spooky or strange or unusual story about every single element on the periodic table. And I did manage to cram all 118 elements in there, even if some of them just got a cameo, just a little brief appearance. But the real motivation for writing this book, actually there were a couple of them. One, I was working at a job I didn't like at the time. So this was kind of my dream to kind of work on a book, get it published. So that was incentive for me. The other motivations, though, were, I don't know what your experience has been, but when we were talking about the periodic table in school, there were just huge swaths of the table that we never, ever got to talk about. They just never came up in class. And so I wanted to know, what are the stories behind all of those other elements? I wanted to give them a bit of a personality, make them come alive a little bit. So I started to tell stories about all of those other elements. But another motivation for me writing the book was that I knew there were some really great stories out there about elements that everyone thinks they know very well, but that if you look a little bit into their history, you'll find that they actually do have a hidden, unusual backstory to them. And probably the best example of that, of an element with a hidden, unusual backstory, is the element aluminum. So we all know aluminum today. It's very common in, pop cans, Little League baseball bats, aluminum foil. In some ways, it's kind of a throwaway element, one we don't really pay much attention to. But believe it or not, for a long time during the 1800s, aluminum was actually the most precious metal on Earth. It was worth far more than silver was. In fact, worth far more even than gold was. And the reason why is that even though aluminum is very common, it's the most common metal in the Earth's crust, even though it's very common, it's always tightly bonded to another element in nature, usually to oxygen. So it's not like you can go out in nature and find a mother lode of pure aluminum. It's always in mineral form. And it takes a lot of work to get that oxygen atom off there. So when scientists in the very early 1800s started to get the first pure samples of aluminum, it was considered kind of a miraculous metal because it was very light, but also very strong, very attractive. It basically had everything you would want in a metal. And because it was so hard to produce and so expensive to produce, it actually became something of a status symbol for kings and emperors to get their hands on aluminum. So right here, you are looking at an aluminum centerpiece that was made for one of the emperors of France. And that is aluminum on the top, and then that's gold beneath it. Because aluminum was considered the more impressive metal, so obviously you would want to have that on the top. There was another emperor of France that actually had a prized set of aluminum silverware made for himself. And he would share that, and the other guests at his banquets, if they were really high-ranking guests, they were also allowed to use the aluminum silverware. And the lesser nobility was actually reduced to eating with gold knives and forks. It was considered very embarrassing to be seen eating with the gold knives and forks when there was aluminum silverware available. And even the United States got into this game a little bit. Does anyone recognize what this is right here? It's kind of an unusual angle for it, but anyone? That is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., the very, very top of it. And as you can see in the picture here, when they were putting this up, when the US government was putting this up in the 1880s, they decided to put at the very tippity top of the Washington Monument a 6-inch pyramid of aluminum. And it's still up there today. And they did that for a couple of reasons. One, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. or seen pictures of the National Mall, the Washington Monument is sitting there all by itself, and there's nothing else around it. So they knew lightning was going to strike it at some point, and they wanted a metal up there to help conduct the electricity safely to the ground. But the reason they chose aluminum out of all the other metals they could have chosen was that the US government was kind of bragging a little bit. They were saying, we are such an up-and-coming industrial power that we can afford to put aluminum on our public monuments. Isn't that impressive? And the rest of the world was very impressed. For a while, because not long after this, the aluminum market basically crashed completely. What happened was a few chemists, a couple of European chemists and one American chemist, figured out a way to mass produce aluminum, so produce it on an industrial scale, very large quantities. And the American chemist actually became very famous. A young man named Charles Hall. He actually worked on it as his undergraduate thesis project at Oberlin College in Ohio. And then right after college, he figured out this process. He got a breakthrough with this process. So he was only 23 years old when he figured this out. So not much older than a lot of people in this room here. And they called him the aluminum boy wonder after the breakthrough. And probably no one ever made more money more quickly on the periodic table than Charles Hall did, because he founded a company not long after that called Aluminum Company of America, now known as Alcoa. And when he founded Alcoa, he was shipping out about 50 pounds or so of aluminum every day, and that was plenty to meet demand. 20 years later, he was shipping out 90,000 pounds of aluminum every single day, and he could barely keep up with orders. He died a very, very wealthy man simply for his knowledge of what was then an obscure element on the periodic table. And I like this story because it shows how the fortunes of the elements can really change over time. And it makes me wonder, what elements that we really revere today, will people in the future maybe giggle at us that we took those elements so seriously? Or conversely, what elements does no one pay attention to nowadays that in the future are going to be worth a lot of money? The fortunes of the elements really do change over time. They can go from precious to passé and reverse very, very quickly. So that was a bit about my first book, The Disappearing Spoon. And then a couple of years later, I wrote a book about genetics called The Violinist's Thumb. And this book took on a bit more weighty issues than the periodic table did. It's about genetics. It's about, things like health, medicine, privacy. A lot of issues like this come up. But one thing I did want to emphasize with this book was that genetics, we all know it's very important for medicine and things like that. But genetics really has expanded into a lot of other fields nowadays. You can talk about genetics and art. You can talk about genetics and music. You can talk about genetics and archaeology, genetics and computing. There's lots and lots of different fields that genetics has kind of spread into. And one thing I wanted to do with the book was kind of highlight all of these other areas that genetics has spread into. And I think probably the most fascinating thing for me about genetics, here's a double helix, kind of the double helix of DNA. I think that one of the most fascinating things about genetics for me is that it's universal in life, that all known forms of life have DNA, and genes in DNA work the same basic way in all forms of life. Whether we're talking about tulips, or guinea pigs, bacteria, toads, toadstools, slime molds, dung beetles, members of Congress, whatever. Genes in DNA work the same basic way in all of these strange creatures. And I thought, that's really fascinating. It's kind of the unifying idea of all of life. But I did realize that there was one thing pretty early on in the research for this book that's really obviously different in the study of human genes and the study of other animal genes. And the thing that's very noticeably different is the names of these genes, the names of these stretches of DNA. Because if you've ever read a paper, newspaper story, magazine story, or looked at a journal article, something like that, and you saw a human gene name, you might have noticed it was often pretty ugly, pretty long, pretty jargony name. There's numbers and kind of random Greek letters appearing in the middle. These are very, very hard names to parse, even for scientists sometimes. Very, very technical. But it turns out that when it comes to the names of animal genes especially, scientists have a bit more leeway. They can have a little bit more fun. They can be a little bit more creative in naming these genes. And that's especially true when it comes to the names of the genes of this guy right here, the fruit fly. Now, the fruit fly probably doesn't look it. They maybe don't look particularly witty, but they have actually inspired more creative and unusual gene names than probably every other animal out there. So there are different fruit fly genes named Groucho. There's one called Smurf. There's Lost in Space. Fear of Intimacy. There's Tribble, after those multiplying fuzzballs on that famous episode of Star Trek. There's the faint sausage gene. I have no idea what the faint sausage gene does, but it's a pretty good name. There's the Tin Man gene. And if the Tin Man gene gets mutated, fruit flies cannot develop a heart. So that kind of makes sense. There's a gene that leaves a fruit fly exceptionally tipsy after a tiny, tiny sip of alcohol. It's called the cheap date gene, so that kind of makes sense. Probably my favorite gene name, though, did not originate in fruit flies. It was actually first discovered in a mouse. And that gene name is the POK erythroid myeloid ontogenic gene. Now, at a glance, that is probably a perfect example of a horrendous, jargony gene name where you just have no idea what the words even mean, much less what's supposed to be going on with this name. But if you look a little bit closer, the first three letters are POK. Then there's an E. Then at the beginning of the next word, there's an M. It kind of spells out Pokemon. And in fact, the scientists who discovered this gene, they named it the Pokemon gene. They published a paper about it, so it became the official name of this gene. And everyone kind of had a good laugh about this, except you can see right after the word Pokemon there's a little R with a circle around it. And that means copyright restricted. And the lawyers at Pokemon Inc. were actually not very amused about this whole thing, because it turns out that the Pokemon gene contributes to the spread of cancer in mice. And they, kind of understandably, they didn't want their cute little pocket monsters confused with tumors. So they threatened to sue the heck out of these scientists. They were really going to take them to the cleaners over this. And finally, the scientists, they backed down, and they gave it eventually some other terrible gene name. But for one shining moment, there was actually a Pokemon gene. Now, one question people often ask about my books is they want to know where the titles come from. So this book was called The Violinist's Thumb. It's an obvious title for a book about genetics. So where did that come from? So this title actually comes from a violinist, obviously, a very famous violinist. In fact, most people consider him the greatest violinist who ever lived. A man named Niccolo Paganini was active in Europe in the very early 1800s. And every king, every emperor, every queen, every pope wanted Paganini to come play for them because he was the absolute greatest. If you've ever heard those stories about, they're usually blues musicians nowadays, but musicians who have sold their soul to Satan in order to get their talent, a lot of those stories started with Paganini. He was the originator of a lot of those stories because they thought there's no way someone could be this good at violin if he hadn't, had a pact with the devil like that. Well, actually, there were some non-fiction reasons that Paganini was such a good violinist. One of the big ones was he had these amazingly, even sort of freakishly flexible hands. So one thing he could do with his hands, he could take his pinky like this, and he could actually bend his pinky into a right angle with the rest of his hand just by going like this. And it actually gets worse because he could also put his hand down flat on a table, then he could raise his pinky and his thumb behind his hand like this, and he could actually touch his pinky and his thumb behind his hand just by going like that with them. So he could do things with his hands you should not be able to do with your hands. But that actually gave him a big advantage when he was playing the violin, because he could stretch his hands incredibly wide. He could bend them into fingerings that no one else could. He could play music no one else could play simply because of these amazing hands of his. And from a modern perspective, it's almost certain that he had a genetic disorder of some sort. Because it wasn't just his hands that were amazingly flexible. He could bend his elbows the wrong way, his knees bent backwards. He was basically like a circus rubber man. And a lot of the people who can do those kind of tricks do have a genetic disorder in their connective tissue of some sort. And I chose this as the title story for the book for a few reasons. One, we usually think about something like genetics being on one end of a spectrum, a science, very hardcore technical, and then something like a fine art, like music, being on the other end of a spectrum. And we think, there's not really any connection between them. But in this case, if you know a little bit about the music and know a little bit about the science, you can actually get more out of the story. And that's one thing I really strive to do in my books, is to make sure the science isn't just about science. The science is about music or war, politics, poison, lots of these juicy things that make life worth living, except the poison, I guess. But I really want to draw those connections between science and other types of things. And so I really strive to do that in the book, and I think this is a really nice example. But the other reason I chose it is that there is a nice science lesson buried in there as well, in that Paganini had these amazing hands, yes, but he was also a very hard worker, and he loved playing and practicing music. So it was kind of a perfect storm of all of these things coming together in one person to make such a great violinist. It's not like he just had these amazing hands and then poof, he was the best musician ever. He had to work very hard, and he grew up in an environment that rewarded the type of work he was doing. And if you talk to geneticists nowadays about the type of work they're doing, those kind of gene-environment-temperament interactions are really where the field is going. Those are very, very important, very big issues that they are working toward and trying to decipher right now. So there's a very good science lesson about where the field is going, I think, buried in this story about the life of Niccolò Paganini. I think that's really cool. You can look at someone who died a few hundred years ago and kind of get an insight into where science might be going nowadays. So that's what I was trying to do in naming this book, The Violinist's Thumb. So again, that was my second book. And then a few years after that, I published a book called The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons. So this book obviously is about neuroscience, kind of psychology, things like that. And another question people often have with the books is they want to know, why did you write this book? Why did you write a book about this topic when there are thousands of other topics you could have written books about? Why did you choose this one? And I can say with this book, what really inspired me was doubt, or skepticism, mistrust, whatever you want to call it. Because a few years ago, I was reading some stories about people who suffered brain damage in one specific part of their brain, and their behavior shifted in this very unusual way afterward. And as I was reading these stories, I thought to myself, that sounds like baloney to me. I don't think this, I think the author made some mistakes. I don't quite believe this. But a few weeks later, I was reading something kind of similar about another person injured in a different part of her brain, and again, her behavior shifted in this strange way. And again, I thought it sounded like baloney to me, so I decided I was going to set out and try to prove these authors wrong. Well, it turns out I was the one who was wrong, so I ended up feeling kind of foolish. But I just kept thinking about these stories over and over and over. So what kind of stories were these? Well, I think we can all recognize generally what types of animals are in the picture here. Even if we don't know genus and species or whatever, we can figure out what generally types of animals they are. Well, it turns out that there's a specific spot in the temporal lobe, so near the temples, side of your brain. If you get nicked in that one spot in your brain, turns out that all knowledge of animals can disappear from your brain. So you ask these people to try to tell individual faces apart, they can do that no problem. Plants they can tell apart, that's fine. But dogs, raccoons, elephants, hedgehogs, fish, whatever, they cannot tell these different animals apart. And I just thought this was really fascinating how specific the deficit was. But it turns out there's some good evolutionary reasons for that I explain a little bit more about in the book. But the other story I thought that was even more fascinating involved a different part of the brain that's involved in language production. So I've highlighted in peach there one part of the brain called Broca's area, very famous for its involvement, again, in language production. And sadly, it's fairly common for that part to get damaged, and people can't really speak after that because that part of the brain is damaged. Very frustrating to see, and even more frustrating for them. But in some people, it turns out something kind of different can happen. So if you think about it, the brain's up here, and the part that's doing the speaking is down here. So somehow that information has to get from your brain to your mouth. And it gets there through what are basically biological wires. It gets there through neurons, nerve cells, things like that. And in some people, the Broca's area itself is okay, it's fine. But the wires connecting the brain to the mouth have been damaged. So it's basically like someone went in and snipped the wire or destroyed the wire. So the signals just can't get from the brain to the mouth. But one thing you learn about the brain pretty early on in studying it is that there are a lot of alternative pathways. There's a lot of other ways for information to get sent around inside the brain. And it turns out there's a pathway that runs from the Broca's area of the brain to the emotional centers of the brain. And then the emotional centers of the brain have this other back alley where they can still get in touch with the teeth, the tongue, and the lips. So the direct connection is broken, but there's still this indirect connection through the emotional centers of the brain. So if you try to talk to these people in everyday conversation, they just can't get the words out. It's very frustrating for them because that direct connection is broken. But if you get them riled up, if you provoke them, make them angry, get their emotions involved, turns out they can swear at you, no problem at all. They'll say, you beepity beep beep, and then often they'll kind of jump back because in some cases, they didn't even realize themselves they could say words, much less these words out of all words. But because the emotional centers of the brain were involved, it was able to kind of jumpstart the mouth and get those words going. Something similar can happen with the musical centers of the brain, where there's a back alley, runs to the musical centers, goes to the teeth, the tongue, and the lips. And these people can't have a conversation, everyday terms, but they can sing song lyrics, no problem at all. And it turns out there was a congresswoman from Arizona a few years ago, Gabrielle Giffords. She was giving a speech. She got shot in the head. And she was one of the people who couldn't speak, but she could sing song lyrics. And when she was in rehab, she was singing songs like Girls Just Want to Have Fun. I don't know why, Cyndi Lauper, out of all the songs that could have stuck in her head, was one of the ones she could sing. But by practicing singing over and over, she was eventually able to regain some ability to speak. So learning about these different pathways in the brain, really, they were able to kind of rehab her based on this information. And that's kind of what this book does, is it looks at different injuries in the brain, how people's behaviors change after this, and their actions change. And based on that, we can figure out what these different parts of the brain do. Because nowadays, we have fancy MRI machines, brain scammers, different things like that. These are very, very new tools. They're a quarter century old at most. Basically, the entire history of neuroscience is patients like these, everyday normal people who got injured, who got sick, something happened to their brain in one specific spot, and their behavior shifted. And basically, everything we know about how the brain works comes from these case studies of everyday people. So that's what the book is. It teaches you how the brain works based on these case studies. And I did want to mention one more of these kind of studies. And this one wasn't so much an injury as it was a very unusual type of brain. So this story got started in Vancouver in about the year 2005 or so, with a woman there who was pregnant, found out she was pregnant. And in fact, she found out she was going to have twins. So she was very excited about this. But at one of the late sonograms, a doctor was looking and he said, I'm sorry, I have some bad news. The twins are actually conjoined, what used to be called Siamese twins. So basically they had fused together inside the womb. Well, the woman, she decided she was going to have the babies, brought them to term. And as you can see in the picture here, the babies were actually fused at the head. They had a Siamese brain. And I should emphasize that the two girls, Krista and Tatiana, they're both alive today. They're fairly healthy. They're happy. They go to school. They have friends. They play. They do fairly normal, everyday kid things. So the story turned out about as well as it could have for the two girls. However, because they do share a brain, they do exhibit some unusual behavior. So the part of the brain they actually share is a part called the thalamus. And the thalamus is a structure that sits in the center of our brains. We all have a thalamus. And what the thalamus does is it's really a relay center inside the brain, a relay center for sensory information. So anything you see, anything you hear, anything you taste, that information first goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus figures out, okay, this information needs to go this way, this information goes here. It's a relay center, for sensory information. And because these two girls, because they share a thalamus, in a lot of ways, they share sensory information. So, what does that mean? They share sensory information. What does that mean? Well, it turns out that if one of the girls is, say, taking a sip on a cup of juice, the other girl can taste the juice in her mouth. You tickle one of them, the other one starts to laugh. Give one of them a shot at the doctor's office, the other one grabs her arm in pain. They fall asleep together. They maybe even dream together. And scientists have never seen anything like this, where someone's sharing this part of the brain. And the girls are fairly young at this point. They're only 13 or 14 at this point. So they haven't done any sort of formal studies on them. And maybe they'll decide when they get to be 18 they don't want to do any studies. That's their right to do that. So we maybe never will get to the bottom of what's actually going on in their brain. But it raises a lot of fascinating questions. And maybe the most obvious question it raises is, well, these two girls, they share sensory information. They share a consciousness in some ways, because consciousness, a lot of it, is what we're paying attention to, what we're thinking about moment to moment. So if they share this, are they still two individual people? Are they kind of one larger person spread over two bodies? And maybe it's ambiguous. Maybe there's no clear answer in this case. But I think a lot of the evidence actually points to them being two individual people. It's sort of anecdotal, but I think it does point to them being individuals. So one thing, for instance, the girls often walk up to somebody and they'll each say something like, "I am just me." And that's kind of a strange thing to say. No one here would kind of walk up to somebody and say something like that. But apparently the girls feel the need to assert themselves as independent. Apparently they feel like independent people. So that, I think, should count for something. Another anecdote about them that I think is kind of revealing is that one of the girls likes ketchup. She loves ketchup on her hot dogs, on her fries, all sorts of stuff. Unfortunately, her sister hates ketchup and is always kind of scraping her tongue because she can taste it whenever her sister is eating it. And it's kind of a strange anecdote, but it is revealing in that they're both getting more or less identical input, but they're reacting to it in individual ways. They're reacting to it like two different people. I think that is really revealing, even if it's just one little silly anecdote about something like ketchup. And this is what I'm trying to do at the end of this book. At the beginning, I'm talking about things like, sensory perception, telling colors apart, the basic way the brain works. But toward the end, I'm really trying to get into some of these high-level things like consciousness, free will, the sense of self. And based on a lot of neuroscientific studies going on out there right now, neuroscientists are getting a little bit of traction on these big, meaty issues that we've been wrestling with for a long time. They're not going to solve them tomorrow. You're not going to see, a headline tomorrow that we've solved free will or consciousness or whatever. But we do have a little bit of insight based on these cases where they can see the brain working in strange and unusual ways. So I'm going to wrap up with talking a little bit about my fourth book, Cesar's Last Breath. And this book was a bit of a departure in that it involves our atmosphere, so the air around us. And this is a controversial topic. There's a lot of political fighting about the air, about the future of the air, what our air is going to be, and what we can do about it. And what I was really trying to do with this book, I do talk about those kind of issues, climate change, things like that. But really what I wanted to do is give people kind of a basis for what we're talking about. What is the air even around us? Where did it come from? And right now I wanted to talk a little bit about what the air is, where it even came from. Because the air we have now is very different from the air we had in the past. And I'm not just talking about, little bits of pollution or something like that. It is vastly different than the air we had in the past. And so I thought I would just walk through a little bit about the 4 distinct atmospheres that Earth has had in its history. So very briefly, the first atmosphere we had was right after the formation of Earth about 4.5 billion years ago. Very thin, very wispy layer of hydrogen mostly and a little bit of helium left over from the formation of the sun. It's kind of a comb-over atmosphere, very weak, and it got blown off very, very quickly, disappeared. But that was our first atmosphere. It was just a little bit of hydrogen and helium kind of surrounding our Earth. Then we got a bit more of a robust atmosphere. We had one that was dominated by volcanoes. So very early Earth, very dynamic, a lot of volcanoes, a lot of volcanic vents and fissures, a lot of gases spewing up out of them. And most of them were pretty hot, nasty, reactive gases. Things like ammonia, methyl sulfide, the rotten egg smell, things you do not, or hydrogen sulfide, the rotten egg smell, things you do not want to be around. So this was an atmosphere that was very, very hostile to life. There's no way life probably could have risen on this atmosphere with all of these hot, nasty, reactive gases. But for a while, that was the only atmosphere we had on Earth. Eventually, through various processes that I explained in the book, these hot, nasty reactive gases kind of disappeared, and a nitrogen atmosphere took over. So nitrogen started seeping up from the ground, started getting in the air, and started sticking around. And most of the air still today is nitrogen. And nitrogen's been the dominant gas in the air since about 2.5 billion years ago. It's been the dominant gas in our atmosphere. And nitrogen is very unreactive, very safe. So one of the reasons we have life on Earth is because our air changed so dramatically over time. And we got this nice, safe blanket of nitrogen. And it still makes up about 4 of every 5 molecules we have in the air today, this nitrogen gas. But you might have noticed so far that I have left off one very important gas, probably the gas everyone thinks of immediately when we think of the air, which is oxygen, yes. And actually, oxygen was a very, very late comer in the history of Earth's air. There was no free oxygen gas in the air till maybe, 500, 600 million years ago. And in fact, life on Earth arose well before oxygen ever existed in free form. And it's kind of strange to think about. We usually associate oxygen basically with life itself, but life predates oxygen by a long time. And actually, oxygen, for most creatures that have ever existed in the history of Earth, was a deadly poison. Oxygen was very, very dangerous for them, and in fact would have killed them immediately. They treated it basically like a waste product, something they would want to expel and get rid of. Because oxygen is a very reactive gas, very powerful, and if you don't have the molecular machinery to deal with the oxygen, it's going to poison you. It would be like us walking into a room of chlorine gas and trying to breathe that. It was exactly the same for these primitive life forms that existed way back when. Oxygen was a poison for them. Eventually, though, through various processes, some very clever microbes figured out how to use oxygen, how to harness it. And eventually, they figured out that oxygen is very, very powerful. We suddenly have a great opportunity here. Life expanded. We started to get multicellular life, things like plants, animals like us. There was this big explosion as soon as we had oxygen in the atmosphere. And today, oxygen makes up about 21% or so of our atmosphere. So about 1 in every 5 molecules in our air. But the level of oxygen in the air has actually kind of dipped up and down a lot over the past few 100 million years. At times, it's been as low as something like 15 or 16% of our air. And when oxygen's that low, it's actually very hard to get fires started. Even things like lightning bolts and volcanoes cannot get fires started when oxygen is that low. And other times, oxygen has risen much higher, been something like 35% of our atmosphere. And when it's 35% of our atmosphere, oxygen, fires go up immediately and they burn wildly. So it's a very, very dangerous time to be alive when oxygen levels are very high. And it's also something of a creepy time to be alive too, because oxygen levels, when they're that high, have unusual effects on the evolution of certain types of creatures, especially insects. So insects, actually, they don't breathe the way that most animals do. Most animals have lungs, birds, reptiles, things like that. We have lungs. We breathe oxygen in. It goes into our blood, and it goes into our cells. That's not how it works for insects. They don't have lungs like that. They actually have these pores all over their skin, and oxygen just diffuses passively into these pores. And that's fine for them. It's an okay system for getting oxygen. The problem, though, is that it's very inefficient and that it can't get the oxygen deep, deep inside them. So their interior cells are a little oxygen starved. And in fact, that's why insects are usually such tiny creatures. Have you ever wondered, there are big mammals and big birds. Why don't we have big, giant insects walking around? That is the reason why, because of this inefficient breathing process where they're breathing through their skin. However, if oxygen levels rise much higher, they rise to, say, 35% or so, suddenly insects can get much, much bigger. And if you look in the fossil record, there are actually, you can see dragonflies the size of seagulls. You can see centipedes that are a yard long, spiders the size of car tires, all because the oxygen level in the air was high enough to support much bigger bodies. And who knows, if oxygen levels keep rising in the future, who knows how big these insects could be? They could be gigantic someday. We really have no idea. And so again, that's kind of the premise of this book, was to introduce the air, get you thinking about the air, and to show you what the air is, where it came from, and maybe where it's going also in the future. So that was it. That was a little bit about me and my 4 books. But at the end of this, I have to confess a little something, that I was tricking you a bit in some ways this whole time. All these stories and all the stories in my book are absolutely true stories. But they are stories. And by telling you these stories, I suspect you maybe inadvertently, against your will, might have learned a little bit of science tonight. So I do want to apologize for that. But I think stories are really a great way to get science across, simply because the human brain remembers information best when it's presented in a story form. If you give us facts, data, tables, we're terrible with that information. But if you have characters in there, heroes, villains, conflict, drama, all the juicy things in it, even if it's about science, we're very good at remembering that information. And that's what I'm trying to do with these books, is to get the science across in kind of a fun, lively way. So I hope the talk tonight, and I hope some of these stories have helped you gain an appreciation for all of the wonders of science around us. So again, thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate it. I'll repeat it, yeah.
I was going to ask, what's the reasoning behind the of the Cesar's last breath? You explained the violinist one. I was just curious about the Cesar one.
With that one? Okay, so we asked about the title of Caesar's Last Breath. So it's kind of a challenge problem for physics and chemistry students. They say, a teacher would say, what are the odds that you right now are breathing a molecule of air that Julius Caesar also breathed during his last breath when he was assassinated? And at first you might think, no way. I mean, that was a breath. That was 2,000 years ago. It's gone. It's been completely effaced. But if you look at how hardy air molecules are, how long they stick around in the air, and just how many molecules we breathe every time we inhale, it's something like 25 sextillion, which is a 25 with 21 zeros after it, every single time we breathe, then it seems a lot more plausible. So in the introduction to the book, I kind of talk about how this works and whether we actually do or not. We'll go with you. Yep.
Okay, so I'm wondering, so you majored in both writing and in science.
Yep.
Okay, so do you think it was very helpful, your writing skill, in getting a science major?
So yes, I majored in physics and English. Was it helpful to my writing career to have majored in science?
Both, I guess both ways.
Both ways, yeah. Yeah, it's good. If you want to be in writing in general, it's often good to have a specialty so that you can focus on those stories. And I found science especially, a lot of editors don't have a technical background. So often, if a science story came in, they would turn around and hand it right to me because they didn't want to touch it. They didn't want to deal with it. So I got opportunities to write stories I probably wouldn't have otherwise or wasn't even qualified for just because I had that specialty. And I do think it's good to have even if you do go into science, it's good to know about other things in the world. I think it can make you a better scientist to know about the history of something or to have outside interests, things like that. So I do think, for me especially, it's been very helpful. But even if you just go into one or the other, I think it's good to know about other types of learning, other ways of looking at the world. Do I have ideas for my next book? Yes, I have a new book coming out this summer, in fact. So briefly, what this book is about is, so during World War II, there were a bunch of scientists in Germany who got kicked out of Germany, mostly Jewish scientists. They came over to the US and started working on our Manhattan Project to make the atomic bomb. And because they'd been in Germany, they were convinced that Germans were working on the atomic bomb. So there were Nazi scientists. They'd already founded an atomic bomb project very early in the war. They had the best scientists in the world, a bunch of Nobel Prize winners, and they had the best industry in the world as well, the greatest industry. So they were convinced that they were going to build an atomic bomb, hand it to Hitler, and he was going to destroy the world with it. So eventually, they convinced the leaders of the Manhattan Project to send in this undercover team of scientific commandos into Europe to spy on and sabotage, and in some cases even try to assassinate members of the Nazi atomic bomb project. So the book is about that group of scientists that they sent in there to try to stop the Nazi atomic bomb, basically. And it was a fun book to write. It's a little bit more of one unified story than my previous books were. There were some great characters in there. JFK, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy's older brother, actually died on a mission peripherally related to this. There was a Major League Baseball catcher who spoke like 7 different languages, and he was kind of slinking around undercover in Europe trying to assassinate people. So it was a fun story, and there were a lot of good characters in there. So it's going to be called The Bastard Brigade. So. Yep.
You were saying that all forms of life contain DNA. What do you think about viruses being alive or not?
That's a good question. He asked about whether all forms of life have DNA and what about viruses being alive. So anything we would count as definitely alive has DNA in it. There are some viruses that only have RNA, which is a related molecule. And even viruses that just have DNA, they're kind of on that cusp of living and not living. I would say I would rule probably not living because they cannot really exist on their own and they need other life forms to exist. They can't be independent. But I'm willing to be overruled on this. I would fall on the other side though. Yep. Which one was most difficult and most fun to research? I would say the most fun to research was probably the neurosurgeon's book because it was maybe a little foolhardy, but I had never taken a neuroscience class before that. I had never studied neuroscience or really written about it. So I knew very little about neuroscience going into this. So it was fun, though, to jump into the field and really try to learn as much as I could and learn about how the brain works. So that was very rewarding. Difficulty maybe was the violinist's thumb because genetics is an ongoing, very hot topic even now, and there's just so much coming out about it, and things are changing so rapidly that it was difficult to get some of that information in there. For instance, there were papers coming out right as I was finishing it about the fact that human beings and Neanderthals actually share a lot of DNA because we interbred with Neanderthals a long time ago. So most of us in here today have long stretches of Neanderthal DNA because our ancestors interbred with them. And this was something that no one expected. It suddenly came up as the book was coming out. I had to kind of scramble and get it in there. So it was a challenge to do, but it was fun too to kind of be on the cusp of something, a science like that. Well, all 118, I would say, all of. He asked about which elements have interesting stories behind them. There were a couple, I figured, oxygen and potassium and those, I could find good stories for those because they're common, they're important elements. There were a couple that I didn't expect to find much interesting about, but ended up kind of being fun elements to write about. There's a bunch of elements at the bottom of the periodic table, very radioactive. And there was a gigantic Cold War battle between Russian scientists, Soviet scientists, and American scientists, a huge battle over the right to name those elements and who was going to get credit for discovering those elements. And it was this really long, nasty, intense fight. So that's always fun to kind of write about, scientists like butting heads like that. There was another element called molybdenum, element 42, very obscure element, not well known. But that ended up having a really cool, interesting story. In that, have you ever seen during World War I these gigantic guns that Germany was using? They called them the Big Berthas. That's where that name comes from, these Big Bertha guns. They were massive, massive guns. that were made of iron, and they were trying to shoot them as often as possible. They were so hot, the iron was getting warped. They found out they put a little bit of this element molybdenum in there, it would prevent the warping of the gun barrels. Unfortunately, Germany didn't have any molybdenum stores, and in fact, there was only one mine in the world that was mining molybdenum, which happened to be all the way in Colorado, and it was about to go out of business. So what Germany did was they sent a bunch of undercover agents into the US to try to harass the miners there. They were taking them, they were throwing them off cliffs, they were going into their camps and tearing up their tents and stealing their food, basically trying to harass them to sell the mine. They eventually did to German undercover agents, and they started mining molybdenum and shipping it underground to Germany. And so this was really the most remote battle of World War I, took place in the middle of the United States over this obscure element on the periodic table. So it's stories like that that kind of pop up you would never expect. So I can probably do one or two more. Yep.
I think it's another pair of Siamese twins shared a different portion of the brain, but they don't maybe control like each other's movements or maybe control thought patterns.
Oh, interesting. So if you didn't hear, he asked if they shared a different part of the brain, could they control thought patterns or movements? It would be difficult, I think, for one of them to be in complete control of the other. If they shared a different part of the brain, though, they might be able to influence each other. And maybe even with those girls, maybe they can sort of work together on something like that. So I don't think it would probably be sort of like a puppet kind of situation, but it's definitely possible that they could do something like that. Okay.
Just remind everybody, we've got books outside to sign. Great stuff. Sam, in your edited volume on best science stories, there's several pieces about climate change. I was wondering if you could comment on what you think. How bad is it? What can we do to solve this problem?
Yeah. It's a big problem. It's an important problem. Climate change is happening, and it's caused by human beings, just to be clear. And it is a difficult question. I think it's very clear it's happening. It's a difficult question about what to do about it. And the fact that it is happening doesn't necessarily imply any one policy path or something like that. I think if we want to do something, there are certain technologies I think that we can look into. Some of them I talk about in the book are a little more reckless than others. There are people talking about going up and spraying things like sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, which would basically reflect sunlight back into space. We know this might work because volcanoes often release it, and after big, huge volcanic eruptions, Earth's temperature does often cool down some. So that could be one possibility. However, it would probably change the color of our sky. Blue skies would disappear, things like that. So that'd be a pretty big trade-off to get rid of blue skies permanently for something like this. There are other things like carbon capture technology that could be promising, actually taking carbon dioxide out of the air, but also difficult. Who knows if it'll scale up, things like that. I think it's probably going to be, and what the United Nations is saying now is that it's probably going to be a matter of not whether climate change will happen, but how we are going to adopt to climate change and where it will stop, essentially. Like if we're going to go on kind of an upward track, or we can kind of get it going in the middle now, but things are happening. You can see it coming. All right. And on that happy note, but I will be out signing books, and if you have a question, feeling shy or something, I will be out there. So again, thank you everyone for coming.